Hello and welcome to the Changemakers Toolkit with a disability focus. I'm Dr. Catherine Dean, Access Ambassador to the University of East Anglia and also Associate Professor in Healthcare Research. I do a lot of research on how to live with disabilities and long-term conditions. The boring day-to-day stuff like taking your pills correctly, doing the exercises, sticking with the restricted diet, those sorts of things. I'm also Access Ambassador to the University of East Anglia, a title I took on for myself about 9 years ago and nobody's dared take off me. I've done a lot of things in those 9 years. We now have one of the most accessible campuses in the country. We have an accessible changing place toilet with hoists and benches and so on. We have a highly accessible new science building with labs that are accessible to all sorts of students with a wide variety of disabilities. We have orange lines across the campus that indicate step-free accessible routes. I've opened a planetarium at Winchester Planetarium and Science Centre, which I advised on the accessibility. I've even advised on the accessibility of a castle for Norwich Castles and their refurbishment. And I've even built a roadworks ramp. So I've had a lot of success, and I thought it might be helpful if I shared some of what I've done and how I've done it and why I think I've managed to achieve so much. I very much am a person that focuses on action. Fudge the paperwork later, so I will admit that one of my weaknesses is that I haven't written up as much of this as I should have done. But I'm very much somebody that focuses on let's get the ramp in, let's put the alarms in, let's put the hearing loops in, let's get the access done, and then we'll deal with the finessing and the paperwork, etc., etc. I absolutely accept that being so loud about this, so defiant about that the standard processes can no longer work and that they are oppressive and damaging to disabled people, makes me persona non grata in some circles and absolutely has scuppered my chances of promotion, etc. I accept that. That's fine. Now, I'm not saying that's the only way to do it, but I will note that there's a lot of universities out there and very few have done the rate of change and the level of change that the University of East Anglia has done. And that has been in large part because I have been a pain in the institutional behind to make sure that these changes have been employed. I have just done it on a very intuitive basis, but as am a researcher in behavioural change, I'm going to retrospectively apply the COMBI model of behaviour change and talk you through that so you can see that there is some theoretical underpinnings to what I've done and how I've done it, and that it does fit in within the models that are accepted or effective ways of enacting behavioural change. Just to say that the pushback has sometimes got personal, so sometimes I've had bullying, and Robert Sutton's books, which are listed at the end, are very good for identifying and coping with bullying behaviour. The model is capability, opportunity, motivation and behaviour, and it talks about ways of changing behaviours, and often that it acknowledges that we require change in one or more of these areas. I would say for disability access, you need change in all of those areas, but it allows you to place the system into a new configuration and minimise the risk of it reverting back to the old doing things. Now, often, obviously, this is being used within health sciences to look at stopping smoking or sticking with your diet and so on, but actually it does apply within this system. And one of the key things of the COMBI system is you've got to know what you're doing and why you're doing it and what you're aiming at. And my mission statement I developed using the Simon Sinek books, and I decided that actually my mission is to remove the barriers from accessing life so people can express their brilliance. Please note, not just for disability, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, and that my core values are that I try to do things with respect, that they are fair, and that they are honest. And if I manage to do things in that manner, I tend to find that those are done in a professional and appropriate way. And for me, that's why I do it and how I do it. And my work is very much informed by the social model of disability, and that informs my activism and my advocacy. The social model of disability very much shifts the responsibility for change from the disabled person to their society. So I'm a wheelchair user. I am not disabled by using a wheelchair. Quite the contrary, it is a tool for freedom for me. However, if your building only has steps into it to access it, then your building disables me. Your steps disable me. Your attitude to not have a set of ramps disables me. But I am not disabled by the fact that I use a wheelchair. And in the terms of activism and advocacy, training really should focus on everybody's responsibility to take action. Obviously, it should be informed by disabled people, but, and I very much strongly emphasise this, it really should not be solely enacted by them. It's everybody's responsibility to shift society to being a more equitable place. We have to take action to overturn societal norms. It is currently completely acceptable most of the time to be ableist, and you can actually be quite public in your ableism and say that it is quite unreasonable for me as a disabled person to require society to provide me with services and buildings and so on that allow me to have equal access to everybody else. I'm portrayed as the bad guy frequently in that. Not something I agree with. And who are we targeting? Now, the wonderful comedian Francesca Martinez says there's two types of people in the world: those who have a disability and those that are going to have one. If you think about it, that's very true. And I think that's actually part of the core reason why we have such frequent ableism in modern societies. People are afraid of the future, afraid of that future disability, afraid of the stigma and bias and lack of service that they will face. But I want to tell you, let's take that fear away. Let's change it for the better. Let's be entirely selfish and make it better for everybody. In terms of disability, I regard disability as anything that impairs your ability to do the quotes normal activities of day-to-day living. They can be visible, things like me using a wheelchair, or somebody with a stick or a visible hearing aid, or they can be invisible, and these are the more common ones, so at least 3/4 of them are, and this would be the epilepsy, the diabetes, the dementias, etc. But I also very much emphasise that disability is not just physical. It can be mental, it can be deafness, it can be neurodiversity. All of those things get lumped in my head under one banner of disability. Now, there are various members of the communities that I've just listed that would fiercely resist that label, and I absolutely respect their reasoning for that because of the negative bias associated with the term disabled. However, I wish to reclaim that label and say that I'm proud of being disabled, just as I would be proud of being as I'm proud of being a woman, proud if I were of being black or gay. Because you are not proud per se of the protected characteristics, you are proud of your ability to survive a society that wishes to label you and oppress you just because of that label. Disability is inherently intersectional. As a disability advocate, I have to know the basics of black rights, of gay rights, of female oppression, and all sorts of things like this. I have to know the basics. I don't know as much as some of the advocates and activists in those areas. Absolutely not. I do try to know the basics. I do try to learn, and I make sure that I do, because anybody can be disabled. We have to rise up together. It is no good doing disability rights that are just appropriate for men, or just appropriate for straight people, or just appropriate for those that have the money to buy the access tools. We've got to make sure that no one is left behind. So, improving access is a systemic and cultural problem. And if we put this in the combi structure, we have capability. We need to address structural and attitudinal barriers. We need to improve knowledge and skills. We need to shift opportunities to improve access. So we would like all new builds and all new buildings and refurbishments of buildings, all equipment purchases to be built and bought with access in mind and with the highest possible standards of access being applied. Every person that you hire, every recruitment process, every retention ideas, and all the processes and procedures of the services that you offer and the that you undertake. Motivation. We need to look at diversity as being a positive thing. It has been proven again and again that the better the diversity of your workforce, of your leadership, the greater the improvement in your quality and profits of your business. Also, it is increasingly likely that funders will start to require minimum standards of accessibility and proof that you are addressing the societal biases that currently exist and trying to change them. And finally, training, and we'll talk about this in a bit more detail later. We need training to shift attitudes and behaviours, to improve allyship, and to make sure that bystanders feel confident at stepping up and stepping in and doing things that are positive. And as I've said right from the beginning, I'm an action person. I very much love the suffragettes' motto of deeds, not words. And I am impatient. I am told this frequently, that I'm impatient. I'm wanting too much too quickly. Absolutely I am. I've been impatient since 1995, when the first Disability Discrimination Act came in. People tend to talk about the Equalities Act because that's been rolled into the Equalities Act of 2010, which covers all protected characteristics. But basically, these are the same rights that have been in place since 1995. So I've been waiting currently 28 years. And I don't believe I'm impatient to require people to meet the minimum standards required by law and by ethics and by need. I do hold people accountable to their mission statements. I love it when people write, we really want to do the best we can for everybody. For example, UKRI, who heads up funding in the UK for research, states that they wish their research to be by everybody, for everybody. And I go, that's a brilliant statement. Can I be part of everybody, please? And I really want to emphasise that perfect is the enemy of done. I really want to emphasise that I get deeply frustrated by fellow researchers and institutions and businesses that say, but we just need to do more focus groups, more research, more to identify what we should be doing next. No. There's loads of guidance out there. I've actually brought a lot of it together. It's in the list at the end of our references. Take your best guess. Absolutely make it as informed by the evidence and the documentation and the guidelines and even feedback from those who are impacted by what you're intending. But take action, take it quickly, take it soon. Do as much as you can with the low-hanging fruit that are cheap and easy and implementable now. Do it now. Do it with feedback loops so that you can refine it if it doesn't quite hit the nail on the head. But you really do not need randomized controlled trials to prove that a ramp will improve access into a building which currently has steps. You don't need to do that level of evidence. Get on and get it done. And people say, what should we focus on? And I go, do everything all at once. And people go, but isn't that really hard? And I go, no, I promise it really isn't. It's actually really hard to only focus on one aspect, only focus on mental health, only focus on mobility, only focus on visual access. Do it all. Do it all together. Do as much as you can all at once. Make sure it works for absolutely everybody. Think of the worst case scenario. Can I make this laboratory work if somebody who has no vision at all come into here and work? And I can think of that, and I can find solutions for that. And I do think that somebody who had no vision at all could work in most laboratories if we had put in place the access solutions that are needed. Now, isn't that interesting? Isn't that exciting? Isn't that challenging? Absolutely. But guess what? I think it can be done. Definitely test your access solutions with real users. Absolutely. Check it out. But bear in mind that accessibility is much, much cheaper when it's done up front. If it's put in at the design stage, if it's built into the new build or the refurbishment. I have put in a lot of powered doors across many buildings, and they are a lot cheaper put in place in the first place. Increments are much more achievable and sustainable than big stuff, but never be afraid to go for the big stuff. Do take advantage of serendipity and never fear going big. So retrofitting is expensive. Here's a picture of me pushing open one of my doors in my lovely new science building. Now, each of those doors cost between £1,000 and £2,000 to buy and install into a new building. For old buildings where we spent even up to £15,000 to retrofit powered doors into them. So if you're accounting for the lifetime cost of putting in accessible equipment, you can see that if you were to have a new member of staff who required more access equipment being put in, such as a powered door, that it is far better that your building already has that in preemptively rather than spending a small fortune retrofitting it so that you can get that member of staff appropriate access, legally required access into that building. Small actions can have really large impacts. The one I particularly love are the red cord cards, which were available from Ewan's Guides. Again, details at the end. And basically, these red cords are laminated cards which you slide onto the red cord, alarm cord, in an accessible toilet. And they read, this red emergency cord must hang freely all the way to the floor. If it does not, it may prevent a disabled person from asking for help. Guess what? We did this in around the 200 accessible toilets we have on our campus and immediately stopped the red cords being tied up and hidden away from disabled people who might need them. Such a simple solution, and yet it is so impactful. And take advantage of serendipity. Take the opportunities that are offered to you. So I co-designed a roadworks ramp with a whole panel of people with a wide variety of disability and access needs. And we've created this roadworks ramp, which is really accessible. It's very stable. It sits on the pavement rather than balancing on the curb. It has gripping bits all over it so that you don't slip on it. It has an edge to it, a raised edge, but it's not so high that I can't roll over it on the wheelchair, but it is high enough that somebody using a cane for navigation, if they're visually impaired, can still find where the edge of the ramp is. All those sorts of things, we worked together to create this. And was that serendipitous? I had an occupational therapy student who happened to have a mum who worked in roadworks. She happened to know the manufacturers, and she happened to be able to put us all together, and we worked on this lovely project, and it's now available for purchase. But one of the things that I would say that is often needed in this field is training. But, and you will see this frequently as we go through, it's not sufficient to do training. The result of it, I want you to do training and then take action. Now, you want to do training around allyship, where you talk about the social model, where you make sure that people are aware that they have to step up as allies to help promote accessible working, accessible living. You want to audit your existing policies, your buildings, your equipment against guidelines. And again, those guidelines exist, they're out there. And I would love you to list all your deficits. Even if the money isn't currently available, even if you cannot think how you would solve it, list the deficit anyway, and you'll get there eventually because it's listed. You know that you've got to deal with it. If you do not know it, you will not address it. You want to upgrade the access standards for your new buildings, for refurbishments, for equipment. You want to hold people to the highest possible standard of accessibility, because our current level of accessibility will almost certainly change over time as equipment changes, as technology changes, as people's needs change. So go for the highest possible standard now and expect to change it later. And make sure you have an all staff report faults policy, and that access faults are prioritised. I cannot say how many times I've reported, say, a powered door not being working, a lift that's gone out of order, and people go, "Oh yeah, I noticed that. Did you report it?" No. Why not? That is a very simple, low cost, low effort, anti-ableist action that you can take that really does help get those pieces of equipment repaired as rapidly as possible. And it really should be part of the standard practice that you regularly check the function of accessible equipment. Why doesn't that lift work? Oh, well, no one's used it. Why doesn't that hearing loop work? Well, nobody's checked it in ages. Well, why doesn't anybody respond to an alarm from that toilet? Well, nobody knew it was there. That's no good. That's no use. Got to check that this stuff works. And it should be part of your annual review process that everybody, and I do mean absolutely everybody, as part of the standard annual review, talks about reasonable adjustments. And there's a passport that the TUC have created, and it can cover the needs of other protected characteristics, but it also acknowledges that life is not static, that your status is not static, and that things that worked for you previously in your working practices may not work for you now for whatever reason. In other words, this is just about managing humans, not just managing disability. Obviously, as a researcher, I think it's really important to make sure that you demonstrate allyship in research, that you really should be thinking about making your events, your meetings accessible, that you provide a budget, that you audit and list all of the deficits that you would love to address in that meeting, even if you don't have the budget for it this meeting. You know for it for the next one. You get feedback. You provide contact lists and how to do guidelines and things like this. I've got all of those. Please feel free to use them. Please feel free to apply them. It makes such a difference. We need to shift up the information sheets that describe the research projects that we're doing. We want to make sure that they're available in electronic, hard copy, large print formats. We should be considering British Sign Language interpretation. We should be considering providing videos and easy read options. We should absolutely have a "how are we making our research accessible" section in our information sheets. And obviously we should train our ethics committees so that they are looking for this standard and expecting it to be there, because no matter what research you're doing, some of your participants will have disabilities and you should be accommodating those. Bystander training is when we support people with the skills to step in when they see something that's going wrong. And role play can be a really helpful way of doing this, because it's not something people feel confident about, and they feel unsure how they do this well. They should feel confident about challenging ableist assumptions. I cannot tell you, but unfortunately I can tell you of the number of times I've been told that we can't accommodate disabled students. It would be dumbing down the curriculum. It would be making the information sheet too simple. It would be making the meeting too informal, etc. It's not true, and it really annoys me. There are many people that tell me it is too hard, too complex, too time consuming, and even unsafe to make a venue or an event or a workplace accessible. And absolutely that should be challenged. And of course, there is a real assumption that there is no value added by making things accessible. Oh, well, it's just a few people. It won't really matter if we exclude them. But actually, it really does. And things like COVID really taught us that by excluding disabled people in, say, research, we had excluded those that were at the greatest risk from COVID. Excluding more disabled, people that were poorer, we were leading them to be at higher risk, etc., etc. So the value added is huge and really should be done. Ableist language is something that people get very worried about. Should I use this term? How do I talk about it? What can I say? And I love that you're thinking about that, and I love that you worry about that, but please don't get bogged down about it. So I would definitely avoid would be wheelchair bound and suffering from. I'm not bound to the wheelchair. I'm not into bondage. I'm a wheelchair user. I'm not suffering from my disabilities. Some people may be suffering from them, but don't make that assumption, please. I live perfectly well with my disabilities. And of course, outright offensive terms that are clearly offensive, such as retard or crip or things like this, just don't go there. And yes, they should be jumped upon as hard as any other offensive term that would be used for, say, race. But don't get bogged down in worrying about the language you should use. Talk to the person with disability, ask them how they would like it discussed, and use that. Simple as that. It is actually a tactic to shut research down, to shut progress down, is to get people arguing within themselves as to the best, the most proper, the most correct way of describing these things. It's challenging, it's difficult. You're never going to get it right for absolutely everybody, but can get progress made, and I would focus on the progress and not so much the language. Absolutely, we should be supporting bystanders, everybody, to challenge ableist practices and designs. Now, London University have done some really interesting work on core values that they talk about, and they talk about suppression techniques, counter strategies, and affirmation techniques. And I realised as I was thinking about what I've been doing and how I've been doing it, that actually I've done a lot of this. And so if we talk about our training particularly, but also some of the actions taken afterwards, then you will see what I'm talking about. So one of the things that the most common suppression technique that I find in disability is that we are made invisible. Society invisibles disability. Think about it. Go through any newspaper that you wish to have to hand, any magazine, any book of any variety that has pictures in it. Does it have a single picture of a person with a visible disability in it? There's a lack of accommodation, a lack of representation. That all means that people are less able to get out, less able to take part, less visible. So how do you counter this? What's your counter strategies? Well, bluntly, for me, it's that I'm out and proud. I'm visible, I'm clear, I definitely demand accommodations, and I request them, but I request them firmly. I request them with the expectation that they will be met. But also affirmation techniques that we need to acknowledge, and this with that disability is tough to live with, is tough to work with, is tough sometimes to push back against this societal oppression. So you do need mentoring, you do need specific promotion policies and support for that. You do need to pay for the extra costs. You do need to make mandatory access standards, etc. So you can see you've got this problem, you've got personal things that you can do, and there's structural, systemic things that you can do. So some of the things that I've done: make visible disability pride events. We've done a number of these. The last one is 2019, prior to the pandemic. Unfortunately, that really did kill this off for a while. But this was a wonderful event. We had it in the centre of Norwich at the Forum Library, and we had stands, 50 stalls, 6,000 visitors. We had people like the Toys Like Me group, which produce toys that have visible disabilities to allow kids to play and learn how to work and play and live with people with visible differences. So, for example, that lovely doll has a limb difference. We were working with various groups, and those are representatives of one of our advocacy groups there, Equal Lives, who have the poster behind them talking about equality, diversity, inclusion. They're brilliant. And of course, we did have cute things like Hector the wheelchair dog, who is just so cute and lovely, and got no problem having him along as well. We also had mini donkeys and other things, but it was those, we did this in 2018 as well as 2019. These were very successful events, very positive, very visible, and I am looking at whether or not we should be doing those again. But also we should be demanding attention. We're very happy at our university to fly the pride flag for LGBTQ people, and that's brilliant and important. But should we not also be flying the disability pride flag? We have around the campus a lot of these orange lines that you can see in that top picture there. And this orange line system, it shows the step-free accessible routes across the campus. Now, it's useful to a degree. It doesn't tell you where they're going, so there's limitations to it. But what it does do is it makes it very visible that we are willing to adapt the campus environment to accommodate the people with a different set of needs. So it is a useful thing to do. I have been pestering my marketing team for years to improve the number of photos that they have in the photo bank with people with visible disabilities, and I'm really glad to say that they have done so now. And so we have wonderful pictures here of this wonderful young man using a walking frame, coaching me in a wheelchair there in a gym, and showing that differences and diversities are a normal part of our university community and the work that we do. And of course, you can bring in external people. So here's the wonderful Tom Fadden, who does amazing disability training and accessibility talks and so on. I think for his company, Purple Reach. And again, contact details are at the end. And this is how we start to shift the whole system. Again, another suppression technique is ridiculing, where people, as we've discussed, use poor language choices and make very poor assumptions. Counter strategy is to question this. What do you mean by that? Another one is quite useful, is to fit the protected characteristic. So it's entirely acceptable for me as a wheelchair user to be asked to go round the back and come in past the bins into the back door, because the front door is the one with the posh stairs. And so as a wheelchair user, I can't get in that way. I have to go round the back in the back door. Now, can you imagine telling your black colleagues that they had to go round the back in the back door past the bins? Can you feel your heart sinking at that? We have done really good work around rights and making sure that people understand that that bias is completely unacceptable and unlivable with. And so sometimes it's easier to see that what's been asked of me as a disabled person is unacceptable if you flip the characteristic. And how do we demonstrate? What's the affirmation technique? Well, it's respect. Demonstrating respect for all diversities and variabilities. And this is not just disability. I really have to emphasize this. This is the diversity of being human. So how have we done this? Well, buildings talk for ever such a long time. They speak. And so we've got here our new science building. It's really accessible. The ground floor is teaching spaces. The next 3 floors have labs for biology, chemistry, physics and electronics. And it is hugely accessible. So the visible signalling, the flying the flag, etc., it is important, but it mustn't be all that there is. You've got to take concrete action. And this is where buildings really shine through and allow you to do stuff. There is nothing more respectful than providing appropriate toileting, might I suggest, or nothing more disrespectful than not providing appropriate toileting. We've just done a survey looking at lab accessibility, and in a third of labs, they said there isn't an accessible toilet in the building my lab is in. To get to an accessible toilet, you'd have to leave the building and go to usually another building on the campus or in the hospital complex that they're in to get to an accessible toilet. Now, let's think about that. This is for people that not uncommonly will have mobility challenges, may have urgency, may have frequency issues with regards to toileting, and you're requiring them to leave the building to find a toilet they can safely use. I can think you can see where that is a little disrespectful. But it's also about having things like fire evacuation chairs, as that sign in the corner there shows. And again, the lab survey showed that many people that said that they would need a fire evacuation chair had one. It was only about 20% of people said, yeah, we have a fire evac chair and that's what I need. 80% of people that said actually it would be helpful didn't have it. So it's really quite scary that that level of access is not being addressed. And then finally, things like communication access, and this is the communication access symbol, and we've had training done in our faculty, in our university, by the wonderful Lauren Flannery, who has really pushed this agenda from a speech therapy perspective, but also, again, from a disability access perspective, really talking to people about how we can make sure that all of our interactions are accessible to people, particularly those who may have additional access needs. Another suppression technique is withholding information. And in this context, it's often who's not invited to the table to discuss changes in policy, changes in practice, how to design things, who should be listened to, whose information isn't shared. And again, this is me getting quite frustrated at people not using guidelines that are actually already out there. And the counter strategy is be honest. Have adult conversations about the limitations of your facilities. It is far, far better for me to know as a wheelchair user that I can't get into the front door and I do have to use that back door. But golly, it's better that I know that and don't get up to the front door and then go, where do I go? How do I get in? And the frustration of trying to do that. It's not going to be perfect straight away. But let's have adult conversations about that. Let's be explicit when we want to say we want to invite diversity into our research, into our teaching, into our services that we provide, into the equipment that we design. And acknowledge that that's going to take us a bit of effort and time to do the first time. And we need to use the affirmation of information. We need to require the mandatory inclusion of diverse advisors to inform work, research, teaching, etc. implement access guidelines. And like I say, access guidelines is absolutely what I've just done. I created this whole suite of them talking about accessibility in laboratories, but I'd say 95% of it was generic and actually applicable to pretty much any workplace. And I'd love to create more. I'd love to create ones about outside space. I'd love to create ones about residentials. I would love to create ones about schools, etc., etc. But this is a good start, and I can assure you there's very little original in them. I've just brought together the guidelines, put them into the relevant context, given relevant exemplars, and really highlighted this is how it can be done. It is achievable, and I have done it. Created that new access, new science building. It was built pretty much to these guidelines. But also, you want to include people, quality engagement. I know a lot about disability access, and that's why I ask so many questions and why I really work on trying to ensure good patient engagement in my clinical research. But actually, we created this paper, and it's again at the end, which really highlights how to do good quality engagement with somebody that's impacted by your work. And actually, it doesn't matter whether that work is a drama play or a piece of art or a piece of research or a service that's being provided or equipment that's been designed. Actually, these principles would hold up. They talk about having a shared purpose so that everybody knows what's being done and why, and that there's respect and accessibility, obviously, that stakeholders are representative and that you've made sure of that diversity of representation, that everybody understands the roles and responsibilities that they're taking on in this project, and that they have the capacity and capability to engage, and that includes providing appropriate support, monies and expenses where necessary, but also support and training for somebody that may not have done this before, making sure that there's transparency in communication and documentation, and finally that there's continuity and stability in these projects, that you don't do it once and only once, that actually you have this as a principle going on and constantly engaging with the communities that are impacted by your work. Another suppression technique is double blinding, and this is where if you take exercise, well, you see, therefore, you're not really disabled. You can't be disabled and be doing exercise. But if you don't do exercise, well, that's the cause of your disability. You're too lazy, and therefore that's why you're disabled. You can see why this is called double blinding, can't you? And in terms of access, you frequently see that there's poor access in an area, but you see nobody's here that's visibly disabled. There's nobody here. So no access is needed. See how circular an argument that becomes and how double-blinded it is. Again, the counter strategy is to break the pattern. Hold on to your personal integrity. Recognise particularly internalised ableism and push back against that, and really help yourself to help others to see that this is an unsustainable and illogical set of rules. And reinforce the affirmation technique of double reward, that actually everybody needs support sometimes. Only robots don't need flexibility, and that diversity should really be valued. So part of how I do this challenging ableism, one of the rules I have for myself is remember to place the oxygen mask on yourself first. So when you're on the plane and they're giving out the safety briefing, one of the things they say is if the oxygen masks fall down, put it on yourself first and then help anybody else. You've got to deal with your own personal physical and mental well-being before you can help others. And one of the ways that I do that is I have a footer on my email. So I'm not constantly having to say this, but it says, to find a good work-life balance for me and my family, I sometimes send emails outside of traditional hours. I have no expectations that you'll do the same. So it's highlighting, I'm going to work flexibly. That's my normal. That's how I do it. But I don't expect you to have to follow this. It also states that I mostly work virtually in order to best manage my disabilities. If we're in a meeting face-to-face indoors, I will be wearing a mask and would appreciate it if you could do so as well, unless medically exempt. I am personally at quite high risk of complications if I were to get COVID. I've so far managed to avoid it because I've been careful, because I continue to be careful, because I continue to ask others to be careful on my behalf. Say the reasonable adjustments disability passports from the TUC, really useful, really normalise asking about accommodations for everybody. Mental health first aider, that I am, and again it emphasises that everybody needs help sometimes, and I've bothered to go and get the training so I know the basics of what to do if somebody is having a mental health crisis. Final technique, I believe, of suppression technique is blaming and shaming. And you hear this stated so many times, particularly within university workplaces. Effectively, your inability to overwork is why the project failed or was delivered late. You saying no has overloaded the rest of the team. And actually, the counter strategy is to intellectualize and say, actually, good project planning allows variability, and that diversity enhances quality, and that good planning really should manage a lot of this. And finally, the affirmation technique is to affirm reasonable norms. Sensible working loads are effective working loads. Holidays, leave, parental leave, flexible times, etc. are mandatory, and flexibility is valuable for all of the work. This is highlighted in all sorts of ways, but the unions are great, and I'm a member of UCU, the University and College Union. They've done a workload survey and really highlighted that overwork is ineffective and overloading and breaks people, irrespective of their levels of disability, etc. My survey identified that less than half of the labs that I surveyed had seating, ergonomic adjustable seating in their labs. Can you imagine that? That your workplace doesn't even have adjustable seating, that you're expected to stand all day. And why? Because there's just a tradition of doing that in labs, and actually it does not withstand any serious critique or thinking about. And slightly less usual, but I think perfectly reasonable norms is the introduction, for example, of assistance dogs into laboratory settings. And very much thank you to Empower Ability Consulting Group, who allowed me to have this wonderful picture of our lab dog Samson, in his PPE, showing you that actually it's entirely possible and plausible to have support dogs in laboratories where they're needed. Again, perfect is the enemy of done. You do have to say no in order to have the time to say yes to things. So I've gotten quite good at saying no to things that actually I think others can do just as well or even better than me. But I will say no to them to allow me to have the time to say yes to things that are really specific to the things that I can do. We stand on the shoulders of giants. In other words, we absolutely should be using the research and the guidelines and the resources of others. Do not reinvent wheels, for goodness sakes. Building teams is critical. Solo just isn't sustainable in this area, and change making requires you to have various teams of people to support you in the various ways you want to make change. I am very generous with information, but I do charge for implementation. In other words, I'll give out guidelines left, right and centre because I've been paid to create them in the first place, and it's once and done. And then it's all there, and it can be shared easily and without cost to me in the future. But yes, if you're building a brand new building or designing a piece of equipment or the rest of it, yes, I will very happily help you with the detailed implementation of those guidelines and the consultation with the disabled community that's required to ensure those guidelines are implemented absolutely correctly for your particular context. And yeah, I will charge for that. Don't expect us to do this stuff for free. We're experts. Our expertise should be respected and darn well paid for. And really, we need to change systems so that they support people to undertake positive, proactive, non-ableist behaviours. That systems feel safe, that they do not allow ableist behaviours to occur, that there's redundancy in the system, that if one thing does fail, another thing should catch it, and that it turns usual practice of ableism into usual practice of proactive access. This is just the way we always do it. It's a terrible phrase until it's a brilliant phrase. If we always provide lecture notes a week in advance, that's just the way we always do it. If we always make sure that we have a provision of a British Sign Language interpreter for our major public lectures, that's just the way we always do it. If we always make sure that we check that the venue is wheelchair accessible, that's just the way we always do it. It becomes invisible. It becomes the norm. I very much have created this evidence-based dissent. I'm a researcher. I do research. I write Cochrane reviews. I bring together things. And I've really noticed that you do bring together things, stories plus numbers. So it's really important to have the specific stories, but it's really critical to back that up with this is the anecdote, but actually it's more generalizable. It's more common. It is a common thing. 20% of our population is disabled, but I'm a disabled person and I want to talk to you about my story. We absolutely have to be critical of the current existence system, but really creative about how we solve that. It's really important to support the people like me who are the awkward squad, who are the ones that are going to speak up, who will not be quiet, who do not regard the PR of your institution as their job. So whilst I'll be very proud in stating that my university is one of the most accessible in the country, I will also highlight to them that I grade it as a C- in terms of its quality, and that there is a long way still to go. We still have lots to do. And one of the reasons that I've looked back on and thought, how did I manage to transform my campus so quickly? We got a lot of it done within mostly the first 4 years of my work on it. And actually, I think it was because I was working with an estates team that was used to being challenged on ecological green principles. And they were used to changing what they did to make sure that they met those standards and principles and that they could do that. So when I came in and said, actually, I'd also like it to be accessible, they were more amenable because they were already used to being change makers themselves. So a few last thoughts. Please be yourselves. Personal integrity is absolutely critical to being a change maker and being effective. Do find your tribe. Going solo is an absolute fast route to burnout, and you won't survive the system. It will push back. You've got to have sufficient resilience. Shy girls getting out. It's one of my lovely friends who's more northern than me has said. Basically, yes, absolutely ask for it. Ask for it anyway, even if it's rude, even if it's a bit cheeky, even if it's unlikely to be said yes to. Worst they can say is no. Definitely that instant success is an absolute myth. I've been working on this for nearly 10 years as an Access Ambassador. I've been disabled for, lordy, 23 years now, and this is something I've been working at one way or another for that long. I'm now just starting to get to the point where I'm a recognised voice and I'm a recognised activist in this area. So it takes a while. But also, just keep moving, just keep swimming, just keep chipping away at that agenda. Small changes do add up, and you never know which small change is the one that's going to cause a big flip, a big change. So you just keep charging at it. So I've given you a lot of references and guidelines here. So we've got my guidances, we've got my quality engagement guidances. We've got how we've used those, how those can be used into developing healthcare systems. So that's a system change. And also we've talked about Bradge's work on the core values work from London University. Really useful books. Often honestly these projects are big and complex, and the bullet journal method does help a bit. I will admit I'm a relatively poor practitioner, but I do recognise the value of it. It is tough stepping up and doing this stuff. It does make you afraid to do it and anxious, because it's not uncommon that you have had experience of it being quite negative. So Susan Jeffers' classic book, Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway, is absolutely one to be read. As you will get pushback, as you may get bullying, Robert Sutton's books on the No Arsehole Rule, Arsehole Survival Guide are really critical things that help you recognise and survive such behaviours. Simon Sinek's work on starting with why and finding your why is really helpful to create that mission statement. And Brené Brown's wonderful qualitative research, which has led to the book of Dare to Lead, but also a whole series of other books around leadership, shame, resilience, all sorts of really wonderful things. She is worth reading. Stefan Trzecki and Anthony Mazzarelli have created this idea of compassionomics, and that highlighting the importance of compassion in quality of healthcare, but also the resilience of healthcare providers. And actually, I think it has a lot of transferability to a huge number of other areas. And of course, Susan Ritchie's and team's hugely impressive work on behaviour change. Other training resources, disability awareness training, Tom at the Purple Reach Company, just brilliant. He really is brilliant. But also we've got little links there for guide dog etiquette, epilepsy first aid, and resources around making music events, for example, accessible. Lists around things around web access, deaf access, particularly British Sign Language interpreter agencies that I've worked with who have been completely brilliant. Some basics around toilets and how you list and your highly accessible toilets, particularly if you do have a changing place accessible toilet, that really should be listed online so that everybody knows where they are. But also, if you can't have that, then bring in a Mobiloo changing place van and have one for your bigger events. And then there's various access rating guides out there. Ewan's guide I've already mentioned, but there's Access-Able, Snowball and Wheelmap, and they can be really useful if you're trying to find an accessible venue or trying to find the accessible route from your venue to the main transport hubs. And there are loads of advice on various aspects of travel. There's the link to the Access All Areas in Labs guideline books. Thank you all, as ever, to all of these people who funded and collaborated with me on this research. And there's my email, k.deane@uea.ac.uk. If you want to talk to me, I'd absolutely love to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time and attention.